I'm Julian Franklin, and this is the sixth in a series of discussions with C. Northcote Parkinson, the British political scientist and historian, on the evolution of political forms. Up to this point, Professor Parkinson, we've been considering not only your theory of political cycles in general, but the special cases of monarchy and oligarchy. Now we come to democracy. Could you tell us how this next step in the cycle comes about?
The actual origin of democracy, I've tried to show, is biological. You have something in the form of an aristocracy, a rule by a few. And as time goes on, that few becomes more numerous. It becomes more numerous in the first place by a process of breeding. An aristocracy becomes a more numerous aristocracy. And this is a matter of common observation, that unless you have a very strict rule confining aristocratic privilege to eldest sons, it's bound to spread, and more people are claiming aristocratic privilege, whatever it is. And then it spreads to some extent in war, because your leaders in war sometimes turn out not to be aristocratic by birth, and you have to pretend they are, and so they get ennobled, they become incorporated in some way in the exclusive society, and so one way and another, partly by war, partly by administration, partly by wealth, partly by professional skill, more and more people claim the status of aristocrat, gentleman, whatever it is, and with it the political powers. And so bit by bit, the number having this sort of status grows, and possibly in the last stages the thing then gets hastened by something in the nature of a revolution. But the process is almost inevitable.
An aristocracy, after all, does make some attempt to maintain its own cohesion. Wouldn't then there be non-biological factors governing its failures or successes in this attempt? Such as, for example, the growth of trade and industry, which might create a middle class, making it much more difficult for the aristocracy to maintain power now that a competing social class is becoming more important.
The growth of trade and industry certainly tends to water down an aristocracy by introducing new elements whose claim to importance is on economic rather than on other, say, grounds of birth. But one way and another, the history of aristocracies is one of the extension of privileges to a wider and wider circle. That's the case very much in England, where the middle class has all assumed the status of gentlemen, which was previously that of a few. And the comparison that occurred that seems to me particularly striking in this is that whereas in England the hated official known as the Collector of Inland Revenue addresses the envelope demanding large sums, as I think very unjustly. When he does that, he addresses the envelope Esquire now to everybody who pays taxes. And in the same way you find, going back to ancient India, the saying there that in some of these republics everyone thought himself the Rajah. It's rather the same thing, this sort of status of Rajah, or the status in England of Esquire, which used to be quite limited to landowners of a certain degree of wealth, is gradually comes to be claimed by everybody.
Well, we had our own version of that here in the 30s, you know. Huey Long's slogan was "Every man a king." I doubt if that meant they were all descended from royalty.
I expect they all had to pay taxes there.
But in your discussion of Greek democracy, you called it as real a democracy as has ever perhaps existed. Do you think that Greek democracy is more democratic than contemporary democracy, or is even comparable to it?
Well, it differed in this way. First of all, it was limited in certain definite respects. Women, for example, were ruled out. The very young were ruled out. Well, they still are under most voting systems. But in addition, they ruled out the entire working class, which in the Greek city consisted of slaves, and the slaves naturally had no vote. They also ruled out all people they regarded as aliens. The new citizens of a modern democracy had no vote in Athens. They were still foreigners. and they had all the privileges of paying taxes, but none of the privileges of directly voting. And to that extent, the Athenian democracy was limited. It was the rule of a good few people, but certainly not of a majority. Perhaps a sixth of the actual population might be in a position to exercise political privileges. But as against that, and this is where the Greeks are so much more democratic than we could claim to be in any country today, that their democracy was direct. Instead of electing representatives who would do things, they themselves were entitled to meet en masse in the marketplace so that all the voters could come together and make their will directly known on a particular issue. Well, you'll see in one sense perhaps they were less democratic. In another sense they were at least more directly democratic than the modern democracies, as we call them, could claim to be.
How about guarantees of individual freedom in Greece? I mean constitutional guarantees.
I don't know that their constitutional guarantees were particularly effective. We all know that Socrates ran into heap big trouble, as they say, when he failed to toe the party line in matters particularly of religion. He was not the only person to run into that sort of trouble. I think they were intolerant upon a fair number of matters of that kind. They were also very much inclined to tax their wealthier citizens out of existence, or at any rate out of the ranks of the wealthy, by rather penal exactions, and of course they had no constitutional guarantees against that. In fact, the jury system of Greece, or of Athens at any rate, which provided for enormous numbers of jurymen in a court, 5,000 technically on some occasions, are anything but a guarantee of justice. It is merely making a democratic vote of a matter which should be a judicial decision.
In other words, you say that there's a much greater emphasis upon the autonomy of the individual in modern democracy, although you may not always feel that that's the most democratic element in the Constitution.
Well, in some ways there is, but you have to remember that in the modern civilization, the privileges of the individual have been reduced in a whole lot of other ways. For example, in the education of children in many countries, the individual has very little liberty to choose between one school and another. He certainly can't choose in most countries as to whether to educate his children or not. Perhaps I wouldn't call it an infringement of the liberty of the subject that when he sees a red light in the street he stops his car, or when he sees a red sign saying don't walk, he stays on the curb. These are all limitations on freedom which are in the nature of modern civilization, but they certainly represent a whole string of limitations on freedom which Athenian of ancient times never knew.
Well, according to your view of cycles, every regime has certain characteristic defects. What were some of the defects of Athenian democracy as you saw them?
Well, the first one, to my mind, is this question of taxation and finance. If you give a large number of poor people the vote, they vote to take the money from the wealthy. That's what Gandhi observed, and which he thought was the weakness of Western democracy in our time. Well, it was certainly equally true of ancient Greece, that the poor, or relatively poor, who went the lowest class as we know, but still there were quite enough voters in Athens who could look with envy on the wealthier citizens and think that it would be better if their property was redistributed among themselves. And that's in fact what they did. Now, this created in Athens exactly the internal strains and hostilities which Gandhi observed in modern democracy. And the effect is to create resentments among people who have been deprived of their property under one excuse or another, and who therefore, in some measure, turn traitor to the state as such. They're aggrieved, they feel they've been unjustly treated, and in the case of Athens, a number of them, in fact, went over to the other side in various wars that took place, and proved, in fact, extremely dangerous to Athens, because some of them were extremely able men.
Do you regard this tendency of the poor in ancient democracies to take sanctions against the rich as being fundamentally the same thing as contemporary socialisms?
Yes, I think the motive is exactly the same. Some of the details are different, the methods are rather different, but the basic thing is exactly the same. It hasn't with us as yet, I'm referring now to England or the United States, it hasn't produced that extreme resentment which turns itself into actual betrayal of the country concerned. On the other hand, you can certainly find it in Germany, or perhaps Italy, of the 20th century, very much that motive at work, and with quite considerable results.
Well, do you think that a democracy can function successfully without a great degree of economic equality?
No, I don't think it can. I think that it can function perhaps for a time, but in the long run, to talk about people being politically equal and stressing their political equality is bound to create a contrast in the minds of those who see that their political equality is unmatched by any economic equality. The poor man can be told, you are the equal of the millionaire, you have a vote, he has a vote, you have to obey the laws, he has to obey the laws, you are equal citizens before the law, you are equally bound in loyalty to the Constitution of the United States. There are all sorts of points of equality of a political and legal kind which you can emphasize if you want. But to the poor man, he still says, but he's a millionaire and I'm a poor man. He shoots past in his expensive car and I have to take a bus. And that economic equality seems to the poor man far more important than any of the political equalities which you've told him about at his school.
It's your opinion, then, that socialism in contemporary Europe is more the outcome of the projection of political equality into the economic sphere than the consequence of social changes and discontents projected into the political sphere?
To my mind, it's the inevitable, logical sequel to political equality. Once you've put yourself in the liberal point of view, you've accepted the liberal slogan that all men are equal, that all have the same rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The next logical step from that is socialism. I see no way out of it.
You've been saying that to achieve social equality, a major political transformation seems to be required. But perhaps we Americans have come up with a quiet formula all our own. It seems, after all, that almost any farmer can drive a Cadillac. Of course, he's got to be able to meet his credit payments.
There's something in that, but what the rich man may have that the rather less rich man, though I'm not certain that your farmers can really be counted as among the poverty-stricken, so far as I understand the problem, but where the rich man may possibly create envy is when he controls 2 newspapers and a television circuit, and can influence opinion on a very large scale. And if you have political power held by individuals on that scale, and I think you'd agree that in the United States that's not unknown, you will then get a demand again for equality to the point of expropriating the rich man from his control of means of communication.
Well, that may come about someday. But at the moment, the American philosophy seems to be that if you can give people enough to consume, they don't care about who controls the economy.
Of course, there is such a thing as a depression or recession when possibly views might change on that, or even over questions of foreign policy.
Have you noticed a tendency for this concept of high consumptive level capitalism to spread to Europe? Some people call it people's capitalism, and others, when they talk about it, think of it as the Americanization of Europe.
No, I don't think that it spread to very much of Europe in its economic sense. the Americanization of Europe is taking place in some measure through those great organs of culture which are situated in Hollywood. And the American way of life is in fact represented in most European cities by these mammoth buildings with comfortable seating and air conditioning and nice carpets up the stairs, and beautiful pictures then shown of bathing beauties and gangsters and cowboys and Tarzan of the Apes. This represents American culture to most of the world and does in fact constitute an Americanization of ideas in many directions. But more people can see a film of the American way of life than can afford a Cadillac, except perhaps among the oil magnates of the Middle East.
You said that every regime has to have a theory to justify the way it operates. How does this work with democracy?
I think democracy is rooted in religion, or in particular in one religion, and possibly maybe in others. But the Christianity contains within its body of doctrine the concept of the fatherhood of God, the idea that God is the father of all human beings, which makes human beings brothers and sisters. And if they're brothers and sisters, they're therefore in a measure equal. And I think tied up with that is, if you believe in a personal God of that kind and imagine him looking down upon mankind, the difference between God and all the individuals composing mankind is so vast that the differences between the individuals themselves become insignificant by comparison. Or it could be put in other terms. One could say that the equality of man consists in very basic things. All men are born in the same way as a result of the same biological process. All men, and including women, man embraces woman, as they say. They all grow up in the same way. They make love to each other in the same way, produce children in the same way. They, in the same way, tend to show an affection for their children and sometimes an irritation with them as well. They grow old in the same way, and all alike will die. All those are points of equality, or points of similarity at least, between one human being and another. And if you regard those as the most important things, you can accept a very large measure of equality as existing between them.
It's rather difficult, though, isn't it, to move from the Christian notion that all souls are destined to be saved or can be saved to the idea that all men ought to vote?
Yes, the jump there is perceptible. It doesn't follow all that automatically, but if you once accepted the idea of religious equality, you are at least some way towards the idea that their votes, if they do vote, are of equal value.
Except, of course, that a Christian could say that the freedom of man is something spiritual and inward, and that perhaps the more you suffer and the less power you have in your outer life, the more capacity you have for inward perfection.
That's quite right. There are counterbalancing spiritual virtues which may compensate for physical or mental defects and tend towards an approximate equality. Actually, as a matter of historical evolution, monasteries have given a sort of example of equality and of democracy, which has proved of considerable importance in the development of democratic countries, an example of a society in which all are alike economically. That's to say, they're possessing nothing as individuals. They're probably very much alike in education, because in general the monastic life has been reserved for those who are literate at least, and often learned. They can't be unequal in the beauty of their wives or the number of their children, because wives and children have been ruled out, and consequently they have and quite reasonably, had a very fair measure of equality and of democracy in monastic constitutions. The way monasteries and groups of monasteries have in fact been ruled, not only Christian incidentally, but Buddhist as well.
We usually think in this country, from our experience with the Declaration of Independence, which is mandatory reading in the schools, that democracy has its roots as much in reason as it has in religion, and the idea that since all men are reasonable, then they all ought to be equal.
Are all men reasonable? This is a new idea to me, and women, we usually agree, are unreasonable. But he has a theoretical capacity for thinking, but not all individuals seem to show it in the same degree, and a fair number don't seem to show it at all.
Do you think that when Jefferson wrote the words that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that he was ignoring the fact and unaware of the fact that not all people have equal degrees of intelligence?
I think he got rather carried away by the exuberance of his enthusiasm on that occasion. It's rather significant that after the excitement had passed of the Declaration of Independence, that expressions of that kind were not included in the actual Constitution of the United States, which is a far more matter-of-fact document than the Declaration, as far as I remember.
Well, perhaps you're accusing Jefferson of intemperance here, but I can hardly think of an Englishman being carried away too readily, and yet Jefferson seems to have borrowed very heavily from Locke.
Oh, indeed he did. But there were other Americans who read the Declaration, at least subsequently to the moment of enthusiasm when it was passed, and started looking again at these words about all men are created equal, and then they possibly remembered that they were slave owners, and that this obviously didn't apply to men who were of the wrong color, and then some of them probably thought, well, it didn't apply to women, and probably some elder brothers didn't think it even applied to younger brothers very much when it came to the law of inheritance. And altogether, I think there must have been a body of people who, when it came to the actual Constitution, said, well, all this stuff of Jefferson's may be very fine in its way, but perhaps we'd better omit it on this occasion.
Well, of course, when Jefferson came to spell out the term equality, what he meant, I suppose, was security of life, liberty, and property from unreasonable interference. That might be easily reconciled with a very rather conservative form of political system.
Yeah, I think the original form of government in the United States was conservative. It was not a revolutionary document, the Constitution of the United States, in any sense.
And without necessarily contradicting Jefferson in word, perhaps there was some contradiction in spirit.
It didn't contradict Jefferson, but it failed to repeat some of his more idealistic remarks.
In view of the vast numbers of obvious and manifest differences among men, the term equality is rather abstract. Perhaps it has some meaning as a moral premise or as a philosophic objective.
Well, that may be so, but perhaps in that case, although I'm a doctor of philosophy, I'm not sufficiently philosophic. Perhaps my friends would add that I'm not sufficiently moral.
Well, has there ever been an important thinker in the West who has really argued for the abolition of all differences among men? I'm thinking particularly of Jeremy Bentham, who argues for democracy, as you say, not from natural rights, but from utility. And I might even add Karl Marx, the most radical of social revolutionaries.
There is an argument on the practical side, and I'm glad you reminded me of Jeremy Bentham, because his approach to the problem was a legal one. Now, the concept of equality before the law is one that had wide acceptance from a fairly early period, and more as a matter of convenience than anything else. In the actual drafting of laws, still more in the enforcing of laws, it's very convenient to treat everybody as equal. That hasn't been invariably so in England at various times, and I think there are still laws on the English statute book which recognize differences between one kind of man and another. For example, I believe there is a law in England which makes it an offence to use bad language, and using bad language within the meaning of the Act makes you liable to a fine of 1 penny if you are a labouring man, but of sixpence if you're a gentleman. Now that's a nice form of inequality, not necessarily in the gentleman's favour, unless by the wording you are assuming that he ought to know better. But in actual practice, when it comes to legislation, you have to treat people as equal, and that's of course what Jeremy Bentham had seen. And if you enforce a law that everybody has to drive on the right side of the road, I don't know why you do, by the way. In my own country we drive on the left, which seems to me preferable. But if you must drive on the right side of the road, it's obviously necessary to enforce that law on everyone. It would be no good making an exception for United States senators that they could drive on the left if they liked, because that would probably lead to their very early extinction as a species.
But aren't you admitting then that political equality is thus a kind of postulate of the moral reason?
Well, it doesn't interest me terribly, because my concern with governments is in how they work, the results they actually achieve. And I think the test is of what they do, not of what their political slogan is. And this question about people being equal is to me meaningless for the most part. But even if it can be explained, it doesn't seem to me particularly helpful.
If you assume that democracy always produces a drive for economic equality, and then further assume that economic equality always produces a great deal of conflict and chaos, I suppose this must explain your very serious reservations on the possibility of stabilizing democracy. Are these in fact the kinds of situation that you think bring about dictatorship?
Well, there are two things that can happen. First of all, you have a lower class effort to introduce socialism, which is probably resisted by a middle or upper class group or groups which don't want socialism. And that conflict can end with defeat of one side, victory of the other. We don't know which. Either can happen. Now, if your lower class wins, defeats its middle class or upper class opponent, it does so by appointing one man as their military leader. In a conflict of that kind, the side that first finds an effective military leader, or preferably genius, has an enormous advantage and is likely to win. Once they have one, they have their leader, and it's far easier to appoint one than to get rid of one. Now, if the other party wins, and the reaction against socialism is powerful enough, the parties concerned will have found their leader, and he will have led them to that victory, and there again he will be more easily brought into power than ejected from it. In either case, you end up with a dictator.
I think an example would help to clarify this. In your book, you mention Rome as a case where democracy gave way to dictatorship.
The Roman attempt at democracy happened over a period, about 70 years or so, mainly, I think, because the circumstances of Rome were, in the long run, most unfavorable to democracy. But nevertheless, they reached a point where the forces of lower class demand for economic equality had become very powerful indeed, and they had this period of the Gracchi, which was certainly an experiment in socialism, which included the feeding of the entire populace of Rome, at least it's the poorer classes of Rome, first at a subsidized rate for the grain, and ultimately, by the way, a free issue of food, in fact, to everybody. All this was quite clearly an experiment in socialism, and in Rome a short-lived one, because it produced this reaction from other parties which caused a conflict involving actual bloodshed in the streets of Rome, and from that conflict the only way out was to accept a dictatorship.
Do you think that this model satisfactorily applies to Italy and Germany in the 1920s and 30s?
Oh, I think so. But there's a further aspect of it which perhaps I ought to emphasize at this point, that after a certain measure of disorder, there's probably a majority of people on either side who actively want a dictatorship as a method of bringing peace. And in our own time in France, for example, over the last year or two, where there's been no considerable measure of bloodshed, but with considerable political disorder, instability of government after government, obviously a very large number of Frenchmen have come to the conclusion that to appoint a leader of some kind is their only salvation.
Well, if you feel that there's a drive towards socialism in democracy, which tends to produce conflict, followed then by dictatorship, how would you explain the ability of the English to escape the pattern? Or don't you believe that they have escaped it?
They have escaped it in some measure. Whether they've escaped it forever remains to be seen. I think that the English aristocracy showed very great adroitness in retreating before the demands of socialism. The aristocrats did not, in fact, fight in the last ditch or in any intermediate ditch. They were very realistic and evacuated any position they found untenable, so that the conflict in England took a remarkably bloodless form in which aristocracy was destroyed and replaced by something called democracy, a form of democracy, and that in turn becoming a form of socialism, which of course is how England is governed today, in a very socialistic manner.
Not to say, of course, that there weren't some tense moments in the 20s.
There were some tense moments, but they never actually became bloodshed, which may be a British adroitness to avoid it.
But wouldn't you also have to make exceptions for the Scandinavian countries, which have also been relatively successful in solving their problems democratically? I was just wondering whether one might not say that this more serious Parkinson's law applies mainly to countries who have lacked a deep democratic tradition, countries like Italy or Germany.
Well, they certainly admit exceptions. Well, you mentioned Scandinavia just now. You might equally perhaps have mentioned Switzerland.
Mm-hmm.
I think that where you have a country of a mainly agricultural kind, with a strong peasant population, a good deal of inherent economic equality. I think that would be true of Switzerland, for example, from a relatively early time, that there have been a whole lot of people of fairly similar economic status, that the same problem doesn't arise, that the demand for equality resulting from democracy isn't very loudly heard, because they have a pretty fair measure of equality already. And I should imagine that is probably true of Scandinavia.
If equality and democracy are not inherently or logically incompatible, but it's merely a problem of transition, perhaps then Lenin was right after all, that only after a ruthless dictatorship, whether a democratically controlled one or not, can a genuine socialist and democratic society be established.
Well, that would have to be on a very long-range view of the problem, because Russia was certainly a case where the violence produced a very totalitarian form of government, whether you regard it as dictatorship or not.
Mm-hmm.
And in our own time, that government has shown no symptoms of becoming more liberal in its outlook.
Mm-hmm.
Or very few symptoms, perhaps.
Well, I was just wondering whether you regarded the totalitarian dictatorship in Russia as the transition back to the beginning of the cycle, creating the basis for a new democratic development.
I think that the cycle is quite possibly observable in Russia. And on the other hand, Russia is a country very peculiar in its size and diversity. There are over 70 languages spoken and taught in the Russian schools. The distances from east to west and north to south run into thousands of miles. The differences in race go from the Siberian, the Mongol, the semi-Chinese of the far east of Russia to the semi-Germanic people of the extreme west, with all sorts of varieties of religion between Islam and Judaism and heaven knows what beside. Well, in a country of that size and that diversity, and a country, by the way, which was extremely backward until very recent times, the problems of rule are considerable. And I shouldn't imagine that Russia could be ruled on the same lines as, shall we say, New Zealand. In any case, the problem to be solved is different in its nature. And I can see that in Russia they found some sort of an answer to this problem when they had a divine emperor who could, in a sense, be thought to be everywhere. And they've certainly shown signs since of harking back to that idea of a divine emperor, a divine ruler who could be everywhere. And in a country of that size and diversity, I think one might expect to find the cycle in operation, but lingering very much longer at the particular point in the cycle where the greatest stability is achieved. I should expect to see Russia rather coming round repeatedly to the same sort of pattern of the deified emperor.
Well, we'll go on to that point a bit later, but for the moment I wanted to ask you whether you agreed with the statement of some of the 18th century theorists of democracy, as well as some critics of democracy like Hilaire Belloc, that social equality is ultimately incompatible with individual liberty, that the more you have of one, the more necessarily you take away from the other.
Oh, I should agree with that entirely. The two things are opposed. The more you have of one, the less you have of the other. I think that's shown by a wealth of political experience in all countries and at all times. I'm certainly in agreement with Belloc on that, although not in agreement on many other things. And of course, they represent the characteristic virtues of two different forms of rule. I think that an aristocracy tends to produce liberty. I think a democracy tends to produce equality, economic as well as political. Historically, the process of achieving liberty has been through the powerful individual, the aristocrat, defending his own freedom as against the state, his right to do what he likes with his land, the right to do what he likes in religion, the right to think and speak as he likes. All that has been the aristocrat's contribution. He demands that freedom for himself. Now, in practice, although he demands it merely for himself, in demanding it, he's tended to obtain it for everyone else as well. Of course, England is a particularly good example of that, because in England, they could never really discover who the aristocrats were. And so that going right back to Magna Carta, they started off obviously wanting to draft something mainly for the benefit of a class of nobility. But in drafting it, they found that they excluded their own younger brothers by any definition of nobility. And so they always had to end off by extending the freedom to all free men. That was their only way of including everybody they wanted to include. In effect, they included a lot of people they didn't want to include, probably.
I don't quite understand, though, how what you call the liberties of the aristocrat, from some points of view, by the way, they might be called privileges, represent a universal gain for everybody. For example, what about the hunting privileges of a medieval knight and some of the powers associated with his role as landlord? Doesn't his freedom, his liberty from central control, involve someone else's subordination and enslavement to him?
Oh, it originally did so. Hunting, by the way, perhaps isn't the best example of it, because the hunting done by the medieval knight was originally a social service in exterminating wolves or pigs, which were destructive to the crops. He was, in fact, doing a service, and he's usually represented in the sort of early tapestries and carrying a spear. It's a pig-sticking spear, actually, and was a symbol of a social service that he was prepared to render. However, that's not what you're trying to get at. Originally, no doubt, the lord of the manor had many privileges, which he had at the expense of those below him, as well as at the expense of the king. On the one hand, his privileges limited the powers of the state or the king, and on the other hand, I quite agree, they limited the powers of his tenants, serfs, servants, and the rest. But as time went on, the legal tendency was for his freedoms, his liberties, to be extended to other people. And this was partly biological again. It's the question of the younger sons. If he had 4 or 5 sons, he could leave his estate and his privileges and his powers of oppression only to the one, the eldest. If the estate was to be preserved as an entity, as a going concern, the other 4 sons are left over. They're of the same birth. And when it came to legislation, protecting his own privileges, he wanted to protect the younger sons as well, and in doing so, protected the next class lower, the yeoman farmer. And he always managed to get in because of the difficulty of distinguishing the yeoman farmer from the younger son of the knight. Economically, they're pretty much on a level. And once you've done that, you find that the brother of the yeoman farmer is a trader in the nearest town. You have to protect him too. And so it gradually extends to a wider and wider number of people. It may take considerable time to do it.
Well, in this process of generalizing and universalizing aristocratic liberties, isn't there a loss of the original privileges, and therefore an increasing social equality? Therefore, social equality and liberty would be going together, and I would want to generalize that for almost any form of social inequality, say the ownership of a factory, which involves power over somebody else.
Yes, but the two tendencies are nevertheless against each other. Let's consider it historically for a moment. The highest point in liberty was in the late 18th century, when the United States came into being. There was a very great emphasis then on the concept of liberty, and very naturally in America, because, after all, it was liberty that the original settlers had, to some extent, been seeking, and they valued it the more. And so you find in early American history a very considerable stress on freedom, very little stress on equality. Equality before the law, but that wasn't their main concern. And in England of that day you find the same thing, that these phrases like the Englishman's house is his castle, this idea of trial by jury, freedom from arrest, the laws which made it impossible to search somebody's house in order to find incriminating documents, anything of that kind. It reached a very high level in the 18th century of the things the state could not do against the individual. There were some things it could do, by the way, but these had mainly arisen from the squire defending his privileges and thereby indirectly defending everyone else. I'm not giving him credit for it. It's the way it happened. After that, as soon as you start this opposite process, in the later 19th century particularly, of equality, you start cutting down the liberty automatically, because in order to produce that equality of status, you have to introduce laws which limit the right of the individual.
I think I understand your argument. I just wanted to raise one final point about it. In the 18th century, liberty and equality went together, in a sense, because society itself, particularly in the United States, was relatively equal. It was essentially a yeoman kind of society.
You're talking of the northern states or the southern?
I mean primarily the northern states, where democracy and liberty were perhaps more vigorous. The western states, which are the source of most democratic and libertarian movements in the United States.
Yes, I think that's true. But mind you, that's a different kind of equality. The kind of equality that is inherent in an agricultural state of that kind, and now I'm thinking again of Switzerland or Scandinavia, existed in much of the United States at one period. But that wasn't an equality that had been achieved as the result of a struggle. It was an equality that was there from the start. And I think it's the equality that is achieved which tends to overthrow liberty in the process by the mere achievement of it.
Well, perhaps we would agree, both of us, that liberty and equality both become terribly difficult in an advanced industrial society.
I think that is the point, and perhaps in saying that they're incompatible with each other, I was leaving out of account the simple agricultural community where, in fact, both are to be found. I don't think that helps us very much for the future because, unfortunately, or fortunately perhaps, we can't live in a simple agricultural community. At least most of us can't, because our civilization has got beyond that point.
It seems sort of a paradox, isn't it, that in this modern period, people seem to want democracy so badly. I assume even they wanted it very badly in Russia and in China. And yet, the more they want it, the more difficult it becomes to get.
Yes, but whatever they want, the actual record of the 20th century, when you come to consider it, is mainly one of dictatorships. There are exceptions to it, but the list of dictatorships that have come into being since 1900 is quite impressive when you come to consider not merely Germany and Italy, but Turkey and Portugal and Spain, and so on and so on. The list is a long one.
In all of this, we keep returning to the point that democracy tends to turn into dictatorship. And you certainly have put your finger on a central phenomenon of modern political change, the growing list of dictatorships replacing democracy that we see around us. Well then, I suppose that we've covered, Professor Parkinson, the questions of the more traditional forms of government, monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. In our next discussion, I should like to go on and analyze the concept of dictatorship more closely and ask you to distinguish its modern features.